Hi, I'm Peter. Today, we're moving from the research approaches we have discussed in the previous weeks into qualitative research. So far, we have spent quite a lot of time thinking about quantitative research. For example, we have discussed variables, measurements, experiments, correlation, descriptive statistics, and data display. These approaches are useful when researchers want to measure something or comparing group or examine whether variables are related. However, not all psychological research questions are best answered through numbers. Sometimes researchers want to understand people's experiences, meanings, perspectives, and interpretations. For this kind of question, qualitative research can be very useful. In the first part of today's lecture, we will focus on what qualitative research is, what assumptions often sit behind it, and how it differs from quantitative research. So, qualitative research is an approach used to explore how people understand their experiences, situations, and social world. The key word here is understand. In qualitative research, the researcher is often interested in how people make sense of something. For example, we might want to understand how mature students experience returning to higher education, how people describe living with a long-term health condition, how people manage work and family responsibilities, or how individuals make sense of social rejection. Unlike quantitative research, qualitative research does not mainly focus on numerical measurements. Instead, it usually works with non-numerical data. This might include words, narratives, discussions, interviews, observations, written accounts, or media text. For example, imagine we are interested in mature students' experiences of returning to higher education while also managing work and family responsibilities. Quantitative researchers might ask students to complete a questionnaire and rate their stress or confidence from 1 to 10. That would give us numerical data. But qualitative researchers might instead ask students to describe what it is like to study while also working, caring for children, managing finance, or returning to academic writing after a long time away from education. Both approaches can be valuable, but they produce different kind of knowledge. Quantitative research might tell us how many mature students report high stress. Qualitative research might help us understand what that stress actually feels like, or what caused it, or how students manage it, and what kind of support they find meaningful. Qualitative research is particularly useful when the aim is to examine meanings, perspectives, and life experiences in depth, rather than asking only how many students are stressed. Qualitative research might ask how do mature students experience balancing university study with work and family life? Or what does returning to education means to them? So the focus is not just on the outcome, it is also on the context, the process, and the meaning behind people's experiences. To understand qualitative research properly, we also need to think about some of the assumptions behind it. The key assumption is that human experience is complex. People not simply respond to events in identical ways. Their experiences are shaped by personal history, social context, culture, relationships, expectations, responsibilities, and the way they interpret the situation. For example, two mature students may both submit an assignment late. From the outside, the behavior looks the same. However, the meaning behind that behavior may be very different. One student may have struggled because their child was unwell. Another may have had a shift pattern change at work, or another may have felt unsure about academic writing because they have been away from education for many years. Another may have had caring responsibilities for an older family member. Quantitative approach might record this simply as late submission, yes or no. That can be useful in some contexts, especially if we want to identify patterns across a large number of students. However, it does not tell us much about the experience behind the late submission. Qualitative approach will ask what the experience means for the students, what barriers they faced, what support they used, and how they made sense of the situation. Similarly, if a mature student does not speak in class, we should not automatically assume that they are disengaged. They may be tired after work, worried about sounding less academic than other students, balancing childcare arrangements, or simply processing the materials before contributing. This is why qualitative research does not assume that there is always one simple, full objective interpretation of an experience. Different people may understand the same event differently. Here we have example statements. I did not speak in class because I did not want people to judge me. Quantitative approach might turn this into a score. For example, by measuring fear of negative evaluation using a questionnaire, that can be useful. But a qualitative approach will look more closely at what the participant means. What does judge me means to them? Who are they worried about? Other students, the lecturers, or their own expectations of what a university student should sound like? So, when presenting this example, do not treat the interpretation as automatic. The statements may reflect fear of negative evaluation, anxiety, previous negative classroom experiences, low confidence, concern about academic language, or something else. Qualitative researcher will explore the meaning further rather than immediately deciding what it means. This connects to two important questions shown here. How do researchers interpret what the participants say? And what does this experience mean to the participants? These questions are central to qualitative research. The aim is not to collect what people say, but to interpret it carefully, transparently, and in relation to the research question. Here we are comparing qualitative and quantitative research. The important point is that these approaches are not simply opposites, and one is not automatically better than the other. They answer different kinds of research questions. When presenting this table, I would suggest moving across the rows rather than reading every cell's word for word. So first, look at the focus role. Quantitative research often focuses on measurement, comparisons, and numerical patterns. For example, we may ask whether mature students with caring responsibilities report higher stress scores than those without caring responsibilities. that will involve measuring stress numerically and comparing groups. Qualitative research focuses more on meaning, descriptions, context, and interpretation. For example, we may ask how mature students with caring responsibilities experience the process of studying at university. That will involve exploring their accounts in depth, including how they manage time, motivation, identity, family support, and academic confidence. Second, let's move on to the data. Quantitative research use numerical data. This might include questionnaire scores, reaction times, frequencies accounts, or physiological measurements. Qualitative research uses non-numerical data, such as interview transcripts, written narratives, discussions, observations, or media text. Third, look at the findings rule. Quantitative findings often include counts, averages, percentage, correlations, or statistical relationships. Qualitative findings often include themes, patterns, or detailed accounts. For example, quantitative study might report that 62% of mature students experience high level of stress during assessment periods. Qualitative research might identify themes such as trying to study after children are asleep, feeling guilty about taking time away from family, and being proud to return to education. Finally, let's look at the research questions rule. Quantitative research often asks questions such as how much, how many, do groups differ, or are variables related? Qualitative research often asks how do people experience something? How do they understand it? Or what meanings do they attach to it? So, a useful way to remember the distinction is this. Quantitative research is often about measurement and patterns in numbers. Qualitative research is often about meaning and patterns in experience. This is not a strict separation. Some studies use mixed methods and combine both approaches. But for today, we are focusing on the logic of qualitative research and how it helped us answer different kind of psychological questions. This bringing us to the next topic. Once we understand what qualitative research is, we need to think about how it is designed. In qualitative research, design decisions are closely connected to subjectivity, reflexivity, and sampling. So, in the second part of the lecture, we will move from defining qualitative research to thinking about how qualitative research is designed. In quantitative research, we often talk about controlling variables, reducing bias, and using standardized procedures. These are still important in many ways, but qualitative research has a different relationship with subjectivity. Rather than pretending that people's perspectives do not matter, qualitative research often places perspectives at the center of the study. This includes the participant's perspective, but also the researcher's role in asking questions, interpreting data, and writing off findings. So, in this topic, we will look at three important design issues: subjectivity, reflexivity, and sampling. These concepts are especially important when studying real life experiences, such as balancing study with employment, childcare, caring responsibility, and financial pressure. These are not simple experiences that can always be fully captured by a number. They often involve personal meanings, social expectations, emotional reactions, and practical constraints. So, first, subjectivity means that people understand the world through their own perspectives or experiences, values, and assumptions. In some form of quantitative research, subjectivity is often treated as something to reduce as much as possible. For example, researchers may use standardized instruments, numerical scales, or automated measurements to limit the influence of individual interpretation. In qualitative research, subjectivity is not seen only as a problem to remove. This is because people's subjective experience are often exactly what the researchers want to understand. For example, if we are studying mature students' experience of returning to education, we do not want to remove their personal feelings and interpretations. Their subjectivity is part of the data. We may want to understand how they experience confidence, pressure, motivation, guilt, or conflict between different roles, such as being a student, parent, employee, partner, or carer. One student may describe studying as empowering because it offers a chance to change career. Another may describe it as stressful because it adds pressure to an already demanding family routine. Another may experience both at the same time, feeling proud of returning to education, but also worried about whether they can manage everything. So, qualitative research allows us to examine this complexity. So, subjectivity can be useful because um, it helps reveal personal meanings and lived experiences. It allows researchers to understand participants' viewpoints in depth. However, subjectivity can also be a challenge. Participants may describe events in ways shaped by memory, social desirability, embarrassment, or the way they want to present themselves. For example, a student may minimize how difficult they are um, about the course because they do not want to appear incapable. Another student may emphasize their independence because they feel they should be able to manage without supports. So researchers may also interpret data through their own assumptions, expectations, theoretical backgrounds, or personal experience. For example, if a researcher has also returned to education as a mature student, they might assume that another student's experience is similar to their own. That assumption could help the researchers build reports because but it could also lead them to overlook differences. Therefore, qualitative research does not aim for interpretation that is completely free from subjectivity. Instead, it aims for interpretation that is transparent, careful, and well justified. That means researchers need to show how they reached their interpretation, support them with evidence from the data, and acknowledge how their own position may have influenced the research process. So this leads direct to the next concept, reflexivity. So reflexivity means thinking critically about how the researchers may influence the research process and the findings. This is important in qualitative research because the researcher is not separate from the research process. The researcher decides what topic to study, who to recruit, what questions to ask, how to respond to participants, or how to analyze the data, and how to present the findings. These decisions can be shaped by researchers' background, assumptions, values, and relationship to the topic. For example, imagine a researcher is also a mature student. They may feel that they understand participants' experiences of balancing study, work, childcare, and family responsibilities. This shapes experience may um, may help build rapports because participants may feel understood. However, it may also create assumptions. The researchers might assume that other mature students experience time pressure, academic confidence, or family support in the same way they do. In practice, reflexivity means the researchers should pose and ask how my own background or assumptions shape the study. This could include thinking about how their position affects access to participant reports during interviews and follow up questions they ask, and the way they interpret participants' answers. This does not mean the researchers has done something wrong. It means they are being transparent and careful about their role in the research. In qualitative research, the researchers does matter, and good qualitative research acknowledge this rather than pretending the researcher is completely neutral. So the key point here is that reflexivity help make qualitative research more transparent and better justified. It allows readers to understand how the researcher's role may have shaped the research process and the findings. Now that we have discussed subjectivity and reflexivity, we can move on to another important design issue, sampling. Once we know what kind of experience we want to understand, we need to decide who should take parts. So, sampling refers to who will take part in the study and how those participants will be selected. In quantitative research, researchers often aim for large sample because they may want to estimate population patterns, compare groups statistically, or increase statistical power. In qualitative research, samples are often smaller. This does not mean that qualitative research is less rigorous. It reflects the kind of data being collected and analyzed. Qualitative data collection can be complex and time intensive. For example, one interview may last like 45 minutes or an hour. After that, the researchers may need to transcribe the interview, read it several times, code it carefully, and interpret the meaning in context. They also need to examine not only what participants say, but also how ideas connect across the data sets. If there are many interviews, this becomes a large amount of detailed data. So, a small sample is not automatically a weakness. The important issue is whether the sample is appropriate for the research question. For example, if the research question is about mature students' experience of balancing university study with childcare and employment, the sample should include students who have relevant experience of these responsibilities. It may not be appropriate to recruit only full-time students without carrying responsibility or paid work, because they may not be able to provide the data needed to answer that specific research question. Researchers might also think about variations within the sample. For example, some participants may work full-time, some may work part-time, some may have young children, and others may care for older relatives. These differences may help the researcher understand a wide range of experience. Researchers also need to explain why those participants are relevant. The sample should be justified, not chosen randomly without explanation. They need to consider how participants will be recruited. For example, recruitment might happen through university announcements, email invitations, online learning platforms, or student support services, or social media. Each method may shape who is likely to take part. Finally, researchers need to consider whether the sample can provide rich and meaningful data. In qualitative research, richness can be more important than size. A smaller number of detailed, relevant interviews may be more useful than a large number of very brief or superficial responses. So, when evaluating qualitative sampling, avoid asking only, is the sample big enough? A better question is the sample appropriate, justified, and capable of answering the research question? So that brings us to a common question in qualitative research. How many participants are enough? In qualitative research, there is usually no single fixed sample size, unlike some quantitative studies where researchers may use a power analysis to estimate the number of participants needed. Qualitative research often uses a more flexible logic. One important concept here is saturation. Saturation refers to the point where additional data no longer seem to provide substantially new or meaningful information for answering the research question. For example, imagine a researcher is interviewing mature students about balancing study, work, and family responsibilities. In the early interviews, new ideas may appear frequently, such as time pressure, childcare arrangements, financial stress, guilt about taking time away from family, or pride in being a role model, anxiety about academic writing, or difficulty attending live sessions. After more interviews, similar ideas may begin to repeat. If additional interviews are no longer adding more new insights, the researchers may decide that the data are sufficiently rich and relevant. However, saturations should not be used too mechanically. It is not just about hearing the same word again. Researchers need to think about whether the data are rich, relevant, and sufficient to answer the research question well. So, there are two useful questions here. First, are the data rich, relevant, and sufficient? In other words, do the participants provide enough detail to help us understand the phenomenon? Second, are similar ideas or patterns beginning to repeat across participants? If so, this might suggest that the researchers had enough data for the purpose of the study. The key point is that qualitative sample size depend on research aim, the methods, the depth of the data, the diversity of participants, and the analytic approach. A study with uh, a narrow research question and rich interviews may need fewer participants than a study with a broad question and a highly diverse samples. So, sampling in qualitative research is not about simply collecting as many participants as possible. It is about collecting suitable, meaningful, and sufficiently detailed data. So now we have covered how qualitative research is designed. We have discussed subjectivity, reflexivity, and sampling. The final topic focuses on how qualitative data can be collected, especially through interview and focus group. So, um, in the final part of the lectures, we will look at qualitative data collection. Um, there are um, many qualitative methods, but here we will focus mainly on interviews and focus groups because there are two common methods used to explore people's views, experience, and discussions. As we go through this topic, keep thinking about the relationship between the research question and the method. A method is not good simply because it is popular. It is good when it helps the researchers answer the question in an appropriate and ethical way. So, qualitative data can be collected in several ways. The choice of method depends on the research question and the kind of insights the researchers want to gain. One common method is the interview. Interviews are useful when the researchers want to explore an individual participant's thoughts, feelings, experience, and meanings in depth. For example, if we want to understand how mature students manage study around work and family life, interviews may be useful because they allow each participant to discuss their personal circumstance in depth. Another method is focus group. Focus groups are useful when the researchers want to understand not only individual views, but also how people discuss a topic together or respond to each other. They maybe agree, disagree, or build shared meanings. For example, if we want to understand shared experiences among mature students, such as common barriers to attending classes or shared views about university support, a focus group may be useful because participants can respond to or build on each other's experiences. Observation is another qualitative method. This involves watching or recording behavior or the social interaction in a particular setting. For example, a researcher might observe how students use a study space, how people interact in a support group, or how staff and service users communicate in a professional settings. The next one is um, ethnography. So it is uh, a more immersive approach where the researchers studies a group, culture, or setting over a longer periods of time. This may include observation, participation, field notes, interviews, and documents. Researchers can also analyze text or media. For example, they may analyze students' feedback, online discussion points, policies, documents, social media posts, or visual materials. The important point is that these methods um, give access to different kind of data. Therefore, the method should be chosen because it fits the research question. For example, if we want to understand one person's personal experience of returning to education after many years away, an interview may be more suitable. If we want to understand how a group of mature students discuss university supports, focus group may be more suitable. If we want to understand how students use an online learning platform, observation or analysis of online engagement may be more suitable. So in this lecture, we will focus on interviews and focus group. So first, interviews are often described as a conversation with a purpose. This is useful um, phrase because an interview is not just an ordinary conversation. In everyday conversation, topics may move freely and there may be no research aim. But in the research interview, the discussion is guided by the research question. The researchers have has purpose, but the participants' own account is still central. Interviews are useful for exploring participant thoughts, feelings, experience, and personal meanings in depth. They also allow researchers to ask follow-up questions. For example, if a participant says, I found it difficult to keep up with the reading because of working and childcare. The researcher can ask, can you tell me more about what made that difficult? Or how did you try to manage that? Or what kind of support would have helped? These follow-up questions helps the researchers move beyond a surface level answers. The aim is not simply to record that the students found reading difficult, but to understand the barriers, strategies, feelings, and meanings behind that experience. Here, the table compares three types of interview: unstructured, semi structured, and structured. When presenting this table, I would suggest focusing on the level of flexibility. Start with unstructured interview, then move to semi-structured interview, then structured interview. An unstructured interview begins with broad topic. The participant leads much of the conversation, and the researcher use prompts to encourage elaboration. The strength is that it is highly flexible and can produce rich detailed data. The limitation is that it can be harder to compare across participants because different participants may discuss very different issues. For example, in an unstructured interview about mature students' experience, one participant may focus mainly on child care, another maybe on um, financial pressure, another on confidence, and another on care change. This may produce rich data, but it may also make comparison across participants more difficult. Semi-structured interview use a set of guiding questions, but the researchers can still use prompts and follow-up questions. This is very common in qualitative psychology because it balances consistency and flexibility. For example, the researchers may ask all participants about work, family responsibility, academic confidence, and support. However, the researchers can still follow up on what is most relevant for each participant. If one participant talks about starting after a night shift, the researchers can explore that in more detail. In another talks, if maybe another participant talks about feelings proud to be a role model for their children, the researchers can explore that meaning further. The limitation is that semi-structured interview depend on interviewer skill. The researchers need to know when to prop, when to move on, and how to avoid leading the participants. The last one is structured interview. So, a structured interview use a fixed set of questions asked in the same wording, same order for every participant. You can think of it as similar to a questionnaire, but delivered verbally by the interviewer rather than completed independently by the participants. This makes the data more consistent and easier to compare across participants. However, it is less flexible and less able to explore unexpected issue in depth. So the main message from this table is that interviews vary in flexibility. Unstructured interviews give participants the most freedoms. Structured interviews give the researchers the most control. Semi-structured interview sit between these two and are often useful when researchers want both depth and some consistencies. In qualitative research, the best type of interview depends on research question. If we want a very open exploration of a poorly understood topic, an unstructured interview might be useful. If we want to explore a topic in depth while still covering key areas across participants, a semi-structured interview might be more appropriate. If we need consistencies across participants, a structured interview may be useful, although it may become closer to a questionnaire style method. Now, we can compare interviews with focus groups, where the key feature is not just the participant individual's accounts, but the interaction between participants. A focus group is guided group discussions on a specific topic. Focus group often include around 6 to 10 participants per group, and a study may use multiple groups. However, this is not a fixed rule. The most suitable group size depend on the research topic, the participants, and the purpose of the study. The key feature of a focus group is interaction. In the individual interview, the main interaction is between the researcher and the participant. But in a focus group, participants respond to each other as well as the researcher. This can be very useful. Focus groups help researchers examine what participants think about a topic, but also how they respond to each other's view. Participants may agree, disagree, challenge, support, or develop each other's ideas. For example, in a focus group about mature students' experience of university, one participant might say that recorded lectures are helpful because they can study after their children are asleep. Another participant might agree and add that recordings um, reduce pressure when work shift change unexpectedly. A third participant might disagree slightly and say that recorded lectures are useful, but they sometimes make it harder to stay motivated because there is a lack of activities to help them rethink or digest the topic. This interaction can reveal not only individual experiences, but also shared challenges, different coping strategies, and possible tensions between flexibility and structure. Focus group can also help researchers understand shared meanings or group norms. For example, participants may reveal what is considered normal, embarrassing, acceptable, or difficult within a particular social group. However, focus group also require careful facilitation. Um, some participants may dominate the discussion, others may stay quiet. Some topics may be too sensitive for people to discuss openly in a group. Therefore, focus groups are not always suitable. For example, if the research topic involves deeply personal experience, or maybe like financial hardship, family conflict, trauma, or sensitive health information, an individual interview may provide a safer or more private setting. But if the research topic is about shared experience, public attitudes, learning resources, timetable flexibility, or perception of university supports, a focus group may be very useful. This leads us to the final comparison between interviews and focus group. So here, the table compare interviews and focus groups. Again, I will not read the whole table word for word. Instead, use this to make a decision-based comparison. The question is not which method is better. The question is which method best fits the research question. So let's start with interviews. Interviews can provide rich, detailed data. They are especially useful when the researchers want to explore personal experiences in depth. The researcher can ask follow-up questions, clarify meanings, and allow the participant to speak privately. For example, if the research question is about how mature students experience confidence, academic identity, financial pressure, or guilt about balancing study and family life, an interview may provide a more private and supportive setting. However, interviews can be time consuming to conduct and analyze. As, as mentioned, a 1 hour interview may produce a long transcript, and analyzing several interviews requires careful reading and coding. The quality of the data also depends heavily on interviewer skills. If the interviewer asks leading questions, interrupts too much, or fails to follow up important points, the data may be weaker. Now, look at focus groups. Focus groups can generate um, discussion. They allow researchers to see how participants respond to each other, agree, disagree, challenge, or build on each other's views. This is useful for exploring shared meanings and group norms. For example, if a research question is about what mature students think about recorded lectures or timetable flexibility, assumption support, online resources, or peer learning, the focus group may allow participants to compare experience and build on each other's ideas. However, focus groups also have limitations. Some participants may dominate the discussion while others may stay quiet. Sensitive topic may be harder to discuss honestly in the group. Participants may also give socially acceptable answers because They are aware that the other people are listening. So neither method is automatically better. A strong methodological choice depends on what the researcher wants to understand. If a research question is about individual um, experience or personal meaning or a sensitive topic, interviews may be more suitable. If the research question is about shared experience, group discussion, or common view about university support focus group may be more suitable. So to finish, let us connect this back to the whole lecture. Qualitative research is useful when researchers want to understand meanings, perspectives, and experience. In the context of mature students, this might mean exploring how students balance their academic work with employment, um, childcare, caring responsibility, financial pressure, or confidence in returning to education. These experiences cannot always be fully understood through numbers. So, qualitative research allows researchers to examine how people describe these experiences, what they mean to them, and what form of support may be more relevant. This is why concepts such as subjectivity and reflexivity are important. Qualitative researchers need to be transparent about how data are collected, interpreted, and written up. Sampling is also important because qualitative research does not simply aim for the largest possible sample. Instead, researchers need a sample that is appropriate, relevant, and capable of producing rich and meaningful data. Finally, different qualitative methods produce different kind of data. Interviews are useful for exploring individual experience in depth. Focus groups are useful for exploring group discussion, shared meanings, and interaction. So, the central message is that qualitative research is not that rigorous because it does not focus mainly on numbers. It uses a different form of um, rigors based on careful design, transparent interpretation, appropriate sampling, and clear fit between the research question and the chosen methods. So, thanks for listening. I hope you liked today's lectures and see you next week.